The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the hushed murmur of first class. "Miss Carson, please report to the cockpit immediately." Emily Carson's breath hitched. The chatter around her died as curious glances flicked her way. She forced a stiff smile, setting down the tray she had been carrying, but her hands trembled slightly. She walked through the aisle, past passengers who now watched her with quiet anticipation. But as she entered the cockpit, her confidence shattered. On the screen in front of the captain was a live video call. The man staring at her wasn't just another executive. He was Oliver Grant, the airline's executive director of operations. His face was unreadable, his voice smooth but cold. "Miss Carson," he said, "do you have any idea who you just disrespected?" Emily swallowed hard. "Sir, That was Marcus Caldwell." He leaned forward slightly. "The owner of this airline." A sharp, suffocating silence. Emily's heart pounded against her ribs. Oliver exhaled slowly. "I hope you enjoyed your time with us," he said, "because it ends today." The world spun. Emily staggered back, her throat too dry to form words. The captain turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Security is waiting at the gate." She wanted to protest, to plead, to justify, but there was no escape. She had assumed power was only for the ones she chose to serve. Now she was the one being dismissed. If this story got you fired up, drop A in the comments. What would you have done in Marcus Caldwell's place? Let's talk about it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that expose the truth. The first-class cabin exuded an air of quiet luxury, a world removed from the cramped quarters of economy. Plush leather seats stretched out with ample legroom, their golden accents glinting softly beneath the dim overhead lighting. The gentle hum of the aircraft blended with the occasional murmur of conversation, broken only by the clink of crystal glasses as flight attendants poured champagne for their distinguished passengers. Everything was flawless, as it should be, at least for most of the cabin. Further back, a family of 3 sat untouched, ignored as if they were invisible. Marcus Caldwell, a man whose very presence commanded respect in boardrooms across the world, sat with his fingers tapping absently against the armrest. His expression remained unreadable, though a sharp observer might notice the slight tightening of his jaw. Beside him, Vanessa Caldwell held a quiet elegance, her dark eyes scanning the room with the patience of someone who had seen this happen too many times before. On her other side, Jasmine Caldwell, their 16-year-old daughter, was far less composed. One of her AirPods dangled loosely from her ear as she leaned forward, eyes narrowed. She had noticed, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Jasmine's voice was low but sharp. "Mom, she just walked right past us." Vanessa exhaled through her nose, barely shaking her head. "I noticed." Jasmine sat up straighter, her young face set in quiet frustration. Her eyes flickered toward the tall, blonde flight attendant gliding gracefully through the aisle, flashing perfect smiles at every other first-class passenger. Emily Carson. She had moved seamlessly from one row to the next, her manicured hands delicately placing menus, pouring drinks, making effortless small talk with the wealthy travelers. But when she reached their row, nothing. Not a single glance. Jasmine's fingers tapped impatiently on the armrest. She literally looked me in the eye and just kept walking. Vanessa's grip on her champagne flute tightened, though her voice remained calm. "Let it go, sweetheart." Jasmine turned toward her father. "Dad?" Marcus, still relaxed in his seat, barely looked up. "Just watch." Jasmine frowned. "Watch what?" Marcus's expression remained unreadable, but Vanessa knew exactly what he was doing. He was waiting. Emily Carson floated through first class with practiced grace, her every movement exuding effortless charm. She had worked these flights long enough to know how to keep her wealthy passengers happy. The real passengers, anyway. She smiled warmly at an elderly white gentleman, gently placing a linen napkin in front of him. "Would you care for a glass of champagne, sir?" He nodded with approval, and Emily poured it carefully before moving on. Row by row, she greeted every single passenger, except one family. As she approached Marcus Caldwell's row, her steps hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Her lips pressed together tightly, her posture shifting ever so slightly, as if her body had already made a decision. And then, she kept walking. No greeting, no menu, no acknowledgement. Jasmine's mouth fell open slightly. She twisted in her seat, watching as Emily effortlessly transitioned to the next row, handing a menu to a young couple who had just sat down. "Are you kidding me?" Jasmine whispered. Vanessa inhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly as she observed the flight attendant. Emily wasn't even trying to be subtle. But Marcus Caldwell? He didn't move. Marcus remained completely still, his fingers tapping softly against the armrest. It was an old habit, one he had developed over years of running billion-dollar negotiations, where silence often spoke louder than words. Without a word, he reached into his suit pocket, pulling out his phone. A brief flicker of the screen illuminated his face, but his expression didn't change. He typed effortlessly. "We have a problem. Handle it immediately. Sent." Vanessa glanced at him briefly before turning her gaze back to the aisle, swirling her untouched champagne in slow circles. Jasmine, however, wasn't satisfied. "Dad, are you seriously just—" Marcus held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Just be patient." Jasmine crossed her arms. Patience wasn't her strong suit. At that very moment, miles away in a sleek, glass-walled corporate office, a notification buzzed on a private phone sitting atop a mahogany desk. Oliver Grant, the airline's executive director of operations, leaned forward, reading the message. His blood ran cold. Marcus Caldwell wasn't just any first-class passenger. He owned the airline, and someone had just made a terrible mistake. Emily moved through the cabin with the effortless grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, her polished smile unwavering as she catered to the needs of her first-class passengers. The clink of fine china and the hushed murmur of pleasantries filled the air as she poured champagne into crystal glasses, offering warm towels and passing out elegant leather-bound menus. Her hands moved swiftly, perfectly timed, ensuring that every guest felt valued, special, even if only for the duration of the flight. Except for the Caldwells. Marcus remained still, his gaze flickering toward his wife only briefly before settling back into his composed demeanor. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, eyes sharp but unreadable. Jasmine, however, wasn't nearly as controlled. She glanced around, taking in the stark contrast of service between their row and the others. 2 rows ahead, a flight attendant laughed lightly at a joke a middle-aged man made as she refilled his drink. Across the aisle, a woman in designer sunglasses nodded appreciatively as she received her meal selection. And yet, here they sat, untouched, unnoticed. Jasmine let out a sharp breath, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "This is unreal," she muttered, her voice low but thick with irritation. Vanessa gave her a warning glance, a silent plea to let it go, but Jasmine's knee bounced impatiently under the table. She wasn't in the mood to be silent. "She skipped us on purpose," she continued, voice edged with disbelief. "Mom, did you see her? She looked straight at me and just kept moving." Vanessa inhaled slowly, the kind of breath a woman takes when she's been through this before. "I saw," she murmured, taking a sip of her untouched champagne, its bubbles fizzing against the glass. "We wait." Jasmine shook her head, her frustration growing. "For what?" "For your father," Vanessa said simply. Emily reappeared a few minutes later, carrying a tray with practiced ease, her perfectly ironed uniform crisp, not a hair out of place. But this time, something was different. There was no effortless charm, no bright smile. Her movements, so smooth before, now held a forced stiffness. As she reached their row, she barely looked at them, her sigh barely concealed as she placed a single meal tray on the table between them. "We only have chicken left." Jasmine's brows shot up, her body turning slightly toward her mother, as if waiting for her to react. When Vanessa didn't, Jasmine exhaled sharply and looked back at Emily, her expression shifting from disbelief to something sharper, something like anger. "We never even got a menu." Emily's lips twitched at the edges, just slightly, as if she wanted to smirk but knew better than to let it fully form. "First-class meals are limited," she said smoothly, adjusting the tray as if the conversation was over. "Priority goes to high-step passengers." Jasmine let out a quiet scoff, shaking her head in disbelief. Marcus, who had remained silent through it all, finally moved. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone and typed something quickly before slipping it back inside. His expression never changed, his voice never rose, but when he finally spoke, the weight of it settled over the table like a quiet storm rolling in. "Interesting," he said simply, leaning back into his seat. "Let's see how that works out for you." Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Emily with a look so measured, so precise, that for a brief moment she hesitated. The confident air she carried so effortlessly seemed to falter under the weight of his gaze. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet. Too quiet. "High status, you say?" He let the words settle, his expression unreadable, giving Emily just enough time to feel the gravity of them. But before she could react, before she could recover, he simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone and typed another message, one hand resting easily on the armrest, the other tapping at the screen with unhurried ease. "Send." Emily blinked, standing stiffly for half a second before straightening her shoulders and moving on, pretending as though nothing had happened. But the tension around her was palpable. The surrounding passengers had started to notice, eyes flicking between the Caldwells and the flight attendant as whispers passed between them like an electric current. The shift was subtle, but it was there. And someone else had caught it too. Mia Torres had been restocking the drink cart near the galley when she noticed it. At first, it was just a feeling, that familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the way the energy in the cabin had changed. She had worked as a flight attendant for 7 years. She had seen a lot, too much if she was being honest. And this was something she had seen before. Her hands paused over a bottle of wine as her eyes tracked Emily moving through the cabin. There was something about the way she had avoided that row, the stiffness in her movements, the way she carefully skipped over their presence like they weren't even there. Mia exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the cart handle. Something was off about this. She had seen Emily work flights before, knew how she operated, knew that she was good at what she did, but only for the people she wanted to be good to. There was a difference between professional efficiency and deliberate exclusion, and Mia had a sinking feeling about which one she was witnessing right now. Her gaze shifted toward Marcus Caldwell. He wasn't reacting, not the way most people would. No immediate complaints, no raised voice, no frustrated outbursts. That, more than anything, sent a chill down Mia's spine. Because men like him, men who sat in boardrooms with billionaires, men who carried power so effortlessly that they never needed to raise their voices to be heard, they never let things go. Mia swallowed, her fingers tapping lightly against the metal cart. Something was about to happen, and she had a feeling that Emily Carson had just made a mistake she couldn't take back. The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the quiet hum of first class. "Miss Carson, please report to the cockpit immediately." Emily froze mid-step, her fingers tightening around the drink tray she had just picked up. The words echoed in her head, sharp and absolute, sending a cold wave down her spine. Passengers glanced up from their seats, a few raising curious eyebrows, while others exchanged hushed whispers. She forced a tight smile, setting down the tray with carefully measured movements. But her hands were clammy, her pulse hammering against her ribs. This had to be routine. Maybe the captain needed clarification on meal service. Maybe there was a scheduling issue. Maybe... No, she wasn't that naive. Her body knew before her mind fully accepted it. The weight in her stomach told her this wasn't routine. This was something else. Something worse. Mia Torres watched her carefully from across the cabin, her lips pressing into a thin line. Emily could feel her gaze, the knowing look in her eyes, No sympathy, no amusement, just recognition, as if she had already figured out exactly what was happening before Emily herself had. Straightening her uniform, Emily forced her feet to move. She walked through the cabin with carefully placed steps, ignoring the sensation of eyes following her. The murmurs grew quieter as she reached the cockpit door, her hand hovering just slightly before knocking. A voice from inside, calm, even, told her to enter. She stepped in and her breath hitched. Captain Richardson sat in his chair, his hands folded over the controls, but he wasn't alone. Mounted on the small in-flight screen was a live video call, the sharp, unreadable gaze of Oliver Grant staring directly at her, the executive director of operations. The realization slammed into her like a sudden drop in turbulence. Her throat went dry, fingers twitching slightly at her sides. She had only ever seen Oliver Grant in company emails, press releases, never face-to-face. "Ms. Carson?" Grant said, his voice smooth but carrying a weight that settled heavy in the air. "Do you have any idea who you've been mistreating today?" Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Richardson exhaled slowly, giving her a measured look. "You just denied service to the owner of this airline." Emily's mouth went dry, her pulse hammering so loudly she swore it echoed in the small cockpit. The room felt suffocating, the air too thin, pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. She darted a glance at Captain Richardson, hoping for some indication that this wasn't as bad as it felt, but his expression was unreadable. Calm, firm, expectant. On the screen, Oliver Grant's gaze didn't waver, sharp and cutting, as if he could see straight through her. "Miss Carson, do you know who you've been mistreating?" The words sent a violent chill through her. Mistreating. He hadn't said overlooked or misunderstood, or any of the other corporate-friendly terms they used in meetings. He had gone straight for the throat. Emily forced herself to swallow, pushing back the dryness in her throat. "Sir, I don't understand." Captain Richardson leaned forward slightly, his hand still resting on the controls, his voice level. "Marcus Caldwell? Ring a bell?" Emily blinked, the name bouncing around in her brain for half a second, before the full impact of it crashed over her like a tidal wave. Marcus Caldwell, the billionaire, the CEO, the owner of this airline. Her stomach turned to ice. No, this had to be a mistake. That man. He had just been sitting there, watching, not saying anything. A powerful man would have spoken up, would have demanded better service, would have called for her manager or thrown his weight around. But he hadn't. He had just waited. Realization hit her like a slap. He had been letting her do it, letting her ignore him, letting her prove his point. Emily's breathing turned shallow. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it wavered. I had no idea." "That's exactly the problem," Oliver cut in, his tone ice cold. "You assumed." The word landed heavier than she expected, twisting in her gut. The captain remained silent, letting the executive's words sink in. Oliver leaned slightly closer to the camera, his face filling the screen, leaving no room for escape. Mr. Caldwell didn't lodge a complaint. He didn't need to. The moment you decided he and his family weren't high status enough for basic courtesy, you sealed your fate. Emily's hands twitched, a familiar prickle of panic creeping up her spine. Her mind scrambled for a response, an explanation, anything that could pull her out of the deepening pit she was falling into. It wasn't intentional," she tried. "I just—" "Stop," Oliver interrupted, his voice like a razor's edge. "We both know that's not true." Silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Captain Richardson finally spoke, his voice calm but absolute. "Miss Carson, you need to return to first class. Now." Emily hesitated, her body locking up, but Oliver's voice cut through like a knife. "And while you're at it," he added, "apologize properly." Emily's stomach twisted violently, The kind of drop that happened when an elevator plummeted too fast, leaving her breathless, weightless, helpless. The air in the cockpit felt suffocating now, too tight, too thick, pressing against her skin like an iron vice. She had just denied service to the CEO of the airline. Her hands trembled, but she quickly curled them into fists, willing herself to stay composed. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of twisted misunderstanding. Her mind scrambled for something, anything, to explain this away, to justify what had just happened. But every excuse she reached for crumbled the moment she looked at Oliver Grant's face. Stone cold, unmoving, disappointed. No anger, no raised voice, just that look. The kind that made her stomach churn even harder because it told her she wasn't getting out of this. Captain Richardson shifted in his seat, watching her closely. "Miss Carson," he said, voice low but firm, "I suggest you start thinking very carefully about your next move." Her next move. God. She swallowed, hard. Her mouth was too dry, her pulse pounding against her throat. A part of her wanted to argue, to push back, to insist that it was all a misunderstanding, that she had just been overwhelmed, that mistakes happen, that she wasn't, what? A terrible person? A prejudiced one? Someone who judged her passengers before giving them basic respect? The silence stretched too long. She forced herself to stand straighter, smoothing a hand down her uniform as if that simple action could somehow put her back in control. Her voice cracked slightly and she hated herself for it. "I didn't realize." "And why," Oliver asked, each word deliberate, "do you think that is?" The weight of the question settled over her like a storm cloud, heavy and inescapable. Because she had assumed. She had taken one look at Marcus Caldwell and his family and decided, without even thinking, that they weren't worth her time. That they didn't belong. That they weren't high status. Her own words came back to slap her across the face. Priority goes to high-cess passengers. Oh God. A cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck. "You have one shot to fix this," Captain Richardson said evenly. "Go back to first class, apologize, and pray. That's enough." Emily hesitated for just a second too long. "Now," Oliver added, his voice dropping lower, colder. That single word made her legs move before her brain caught up. She turned sharply, gripping the cockpit handle like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her head spun as she stepped out. The cabin felt different now. Or maybe it was just her, because for the first time in her career, Emily Carson wasn't the one holding the power. And she had no idea what was about to happen next. Emily stepped back into the first-class cabin, but this time everything felt different. The air was heavier, charged with something unspoken. The soft hum of conversation had shifted, subtler now, more cautious. They knew. Maybe not all of it, maybe not the full weight of what had just happened behind that locked cockpit door, but enough to sense that the confident, untouchable flight attendant who had walked through this aisle earlier wasn't so untouchable anymore. She kept her chin up, forcing her spine straight. But the eyes that flicked toward her, some curious, some knowing, some downright expectant, made her skin prickle. A couple near the front glanced her way before whispering in hushed voices. A businessman subtly lowered his newspaper, watching the scene unfold. Across the aisle, a woman in designer sunglasses didn't even bother hiding her smirk. Emily's stomach twisted. She needed to fix this, fast. As she approached row 5, the row she had so effortlessly ignored before, she saw Jasmine Caldwell first. The teenager leaned back in her seat, arms folded, a small amused smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She arched a brow as Emily stopped in front of them, tilting her head slightly. "This is about to get interesting," Jasmine murmured, just loud enough for her mother to hear. Vanessa, still poised, still elegant, gave a soft exhale. the kind that wasn't quite a sigh but carried centuries of patience within it. She didn't look surprised, not even a little. And then there was Marcus. Still seated, still composed, one leg crossed over the other, his fingers resting lightly against the armrest. He wasn't smirking, wasn't frowning, wasn't anything. Just watching. Waiting. Emily swallowed hard. Her palms were too warm, too damp. The words she had prepared, because of course she had prepared something, felt sticky in her throat. Reluctant to leave her tongue. She had to say something. The longer the silence stretched, the worse it got. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Marcus raised a hand. Just slightly. A signal to stop. To wait. And then, in a voice so calm, so measured, that it sent a fresh chill through her, he asked, "Before you say anything, Miss Carson, I have a question." Emily's breath caught in her throat as the question landed. It was simple. Too simple. But the weight of it settled over her like an iron grip, pressing into her skin, making it hard to breathe. Marcus's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes, dark, steady, patient, made it clear that there was only one acceptable answer. And they both already knew what it was. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "No, sir." The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice smooth, unhurried, dangerous in its calmness. "In all your time working this flight, in all the years you've been a flight attendant, you have never, not once, mistaken a passenger for being in the wrong section? Never stopped at any other row and asked anyone else if they belonged here?" Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She could feel every pair of eyes on her now. The once subtle whispers had died out completely, replaced by a tense, suffocating quiet. She should have answered faster. She should have lied. But it was too late now. Too much hesitation, too much guilt sitting on her chest like a boulder she couldn't move. "No, sir," she admitted again, this time barely above a whisper. Jasmine let out a short, sharp chuckle, shaking her head. "That's crazy," she muttered under her breath. Vanessa inhaled deeply, finally setting down her untouched champagne flute. "And yet," she murmured, voice smooth as silk, "you questioned us." Emily's stomach twisted violently. She could feel herself unraveling by the second. Marcus wasn't done. "Did you ask any of the other passengers if they would like a drink before takeoff?" Emily's fingers twitched at her sides. She knew where this was going. She knew exactly what he was doing, and still, she had no way to stop it. "No, sir." More silence. More eyes watching. Marcus exhaled slowly, nodding once, as if confirming something he already knew. He glanced toward Vanessa, then to Jasmine, before turning back to Emily. "Interesting," he mused. That one word sent a fresh chill through her. Emily's breath grew shallow, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. She had never felt this exposed before, this small. She was used to being in control, to setting the tone, to dictating the rules. But now? Now she was the one being examined. And she was failing. Marcus let the silence stretch just long enough for it to become unbearable before he spoke again, his voice as calm as ever. "Did you serve drinks and menus to everyone except my family?" Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Her nails dug into her palms as she fought the urge to fidget, to break eye contact, to do anything that might make this moment pass faster. She could feel the weight of the cabin pressing in on her, the judgment hanging thick in the air. Every passenger was watching now, waiting, their curiosity shifting into something closer to expectation. Her first instinct was to deny it, to say it was an oversight, a mistake, a misunderstanding. But she had hesitated too long already, and hesitation was as good as an admission. She had spent the last hour making choices that she never thought she'd have to answer for, and now, with nowhere left to hide, she was finally facing them. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. A few passengers inhaled sharply, and someone near the front let out a hushed, Damn. Jasmine exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. Unbelievable, she muttered. But the amusement that had been in her voice before was gone now, replaced by something sharper. Vanessa didn't react immediately. She simply studied Emily, her expression unreadable, before lifting her glass again. Not to drink, but as if considering something. Then, in a voice as smooth as silk but sharp as glass, she said, "And yet, you told us that priority goes to high-stepped passengers." The words landed like a slap, not loud but powerful enough that Emily felt them reverberate through her entire body. Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, fingers loosely interlaced. His movements were slow, deliberate, controlled. "Tell me something, Miss Carson," he said, his voice thoughtful, almost curious. "Who exactly gets to decide what high status looks like?" Emily's breath caught. He wasn't asking because he wanted an answer. He already knew. They all did. She had made that decision the second she walked past them, the second she pretended they weren't there, the second she told herself a lie that she had believed too easily. That they didn't belong. And now, for the first time in her career, she was the one who didn't belong. A ripple of movement spread through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, some whispering, others watching openly. The tension had thickened to the point of suffocation, and Emily could feel it pressing against her like a weight she couldn't shake. Then came the unmistakable sound of a phone recording. She barely had time to process it before she saw the man in seat 3A, a businessman in a navy suit, holding his phone slightly tilted toward the scene. His expression was neutral, but the slight arch of his brow made it clear that he was fully aware of what he was capturing. He wasn't alone. A woman across the aisle had her phone resting just above her lap, screen glowing as she subtly swiped up to start recording. Emily's stomach twisted violently. Her breath turned shallow, pulse hammering against her ribs as the realization settled in. This wasn't just humiliation. This wasn't just a bad moment in an otherwise normal flight. This was evidence. Marcus exhaled slowly, not even sparing a glance at the phones recording around him. He didn't have to. His focus remained solely on Emily, his voice still steady, still too controlled, as he spoke. "Ms. Carson," he said, "would you like to explain to everyone here why, out of an entire first-class cabin, the only passengers denied basic service were me and my family?" Silence. A pin could have dropped and it would have been deafening. Emily tried to speak, but nothing came out. She could feel the eyes on her now, not just from Marcus, not just from his family, but from the entire cabin. People who had ignored the moment before were now fully engaged, their gazes sharp with quiet judgment. This was the kind of thing that went viral in minutes. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. "Go ahead," she said, tilting her head. "We'd love to hear it." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no way out of this. The intercom crackled to life, piercing through the tense silence that had settled over first class. "Miss Carson, please report to the jet bridge immediately." Emily's body went rigid. A slow, creeping dread spread through her limbs, thick and paralyzing. The murmurs started immediately, hushed, urgent, buzzing like static around her. This was it. Her mind barely processed the rest of the landing procedures. The pilot's voice continued in the background, making the usual announcements about seatbelts and taxiing to the gate, but none of it mattered. Her ears were ringing. Her vision blurred at the edges. She had worked hundreds of flights. She had seen passengers get escorted off before, had watched with detached professionalism as security approached them at the gate, offering no sympathy, no second chances. But now? Now she was the one being summoned. Her breath turned shallow. She forced her face into something neutral, something composed, but her hands betrayed her. They trembled slightly as she reached for the drink cart, as if clinging to routine could somehow make this moment pass. Jasmine let out a low whistle from her seat, shaking her head. "That's tough," she murmured. but there was no sympathy in her voice. Vanessa said nothing, simply adjusting the bracelet on her wrist, her silence more damning than any words. Marcus remained still, his fingers resting lightly against the armrest. He hadn't looked at her since his last question, and somehow, that was worse than anything. The plane touched down with a jolt, sending a ripple of movement through the cabin as passengers stirred, stretching, reaching for their belongings. Emily knew she should move, knew she should prepare for whatever was coming, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had already reached the point of no return. The moment the aircraft door opened, Emily felt it. A shift, a finality, a cold wave of inevitability washing over her, making her legs feel unsteady beneath her. She had spent years walking through first class with confidence, moving between passengers with the unshakable authority of someone who knew she belonged. But now she wasn't sure she could even make it down the aisle without her knees buckling. Two uniformed security officers stood just beyond the jet bridge, their expressions unreadable, their stance firm but not aggressive. They weren't here to cause a scene. They didn't have to. The weight of their presence was enough. Passengers were already gathering their bags, moving through the motions of disembarking but not without watching. Some tried to be subtle, side-eyeing her as they reached for their overhead luggage. Others weren't so polite. A woman in a tailored blazer leaned toward her seatmate, whispering behind her hand, not even waiting for Emily to be out of earshot. A man near the front shook his head slightly, exhaling through his nose in a way that felt like a quiet judgment. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to move. Her footsteps felt too loud, too deliberate as she walked past Marcus Caldwell's row. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to meet his eyes, refusing to acknowledge the weight of her own downfall. But then, just as she passed, Vanessa spoke, her voice calm, smooth. "I hope you remember this moment, Miss Carson." Emily's breath hitched. She turned slightly, but Vanessa wasn't even looking at her. She was adjusting her coat, slipping her purse over her shoulder with the kind of effortless poise that came from years of knowing exactly who you are. Jasmine, however, was watching. Arms still crossed, chin lifted slightly, expression unreadable, except for her eyes. There was nothing unreadable about those. They held a message. "You did this to yourself." Emily forced herself forward, past the murmurs, past the stares, past the quiet hum of judgment that would follow her all the way down the jet bridge, because she knew what was waiting for her on the other side. And there was no escaping it now. The conference room was cold. Not physically, Emily was sure the temperature was the same as the rest of the building, but the air inside carried a weight, a sharp, clinical detachment that made her skin crawl. She sat stiffly in the chair, back straight, hands clenched in her lap, trying not to let her nails dig into her skin. Across from her, Oliver Grant exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples before finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. His expression wasn't angry. It was worse. Disappointed. "Miss Carson," he began, voice even, measured. "You do understand why we're here, don't you?" Emily swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." A slow nod. He tapped a finger against the table, as if weighing his next words. "This is not a single complaint. This is not an isolated incident. What happened today was simply the first time you did this to the wrong person." Emily's stomach twisted, but she didn't move. Didn't argue? Because what was the point? Oliver glanced at the executive sitting beside him, then at the monitor in front of them. With the press of a button, the screen flickered to life. A security feed, a grainy black and white recording from a flight months ago. Emily's breath caught. On the screen she appeared, moving through another first-class cabin, stopping at a row where a black woman in a crisp business suit sat quietly, looking out the window. Emily leaned down, said something. The woman turned, brows furrowing, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. She gestured to her boarding pass. The scene played out like a nightmare she had already lived. The polite but firm dismissal, the subtle stiffness in her posture, the way she had assumed, without thinking, without hesitation, that the woman didn't belong. Another clip. This time, a black man in his early 30s, wearing headphones, flipping through a menu. Emily again? A conversation? A brief pause. The way she subtly braced herself. She had questioned them, both of them, and how many others. Emily's body felt frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she swore it echoed in the sterile room. Oliver let the silence stretch before speaking again, his voice quieter now. How many times? Emily's throat was dry, her fingers curled into her palms, but she had no answer, because they both knew. Too many. The silence in the room was suffocating. Emily could hear the faint hum of the monitor, the steady tapping of Oliver Grant's finger against the table, the sound of her own breathing. Too shallow? Too fast? The footage kept playing, clip after clip, each one worse than the last, each one confirming what she already knew but had never been forced to face. This wasn't her first time. It had been subtle. It had always been subtle. The polite but firm tone, the way she hesitated when certain passengers took their seats, the way she skipped over them when offering drinks, the way she reserved her brightest smiles and best service for those she instinctively deemed worthy of first class. But it was all there, recorded, documented, undeniable. Oliver let the final clip fade to black before leaning back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Miss Carson," he said, voice flat. "You've done this before." Emily's nails pressed into her palms. Her mouth opened, but no words came, because there was no excuse, no explanation that would make this disappear, no justification that would make it right. She had assumed she could do it over and over again without consequence. Until today. She forced herself to meet Oliver's gaze, but his expression was unreadable now. A wall she couldn't break through. "You didn't just make a mistake," he continued. "You made a habit." A habit. The word sent a sharp jolt of nausea through her. A habit was a choice. And now, for the first time, Emily had no escape. Emily stepped through the terminal, but for the first time in her career, she wasn't walking with purpose. She wasn't the composed flight attendant, moving swiftly through security, flashing her badge with ease, navigating the space as if she owned it. She was just another person now. Her shoes clicked against the polished floor, a sound that once made her feel in control, but now felt like an echo of something she had lost. Around her, passengers bustled, some rushing to catch flights, others strolling at a leisurely pace, dragging suitcases, checking their phones, living their lives as if the world hadn't just collapsed around her. She had spent years deciding who deserved service, who deserved kindness, who fit the image of a first-class passenger. And now, for the first time, she knew exactly what it felt like to be ignored. The space that had once been hers, the terminals, the lounges, the quiet authority she had wielded over every flight, felt foreign now. The airline still functioned, the world still moved, but without her. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She hesitated before glancing at the screen. A message. Not from her supervisor, not from the airline, from him. Marcus Caldwell. She swallowed hard, her thumb hovering over the screen before she opened it. "I hope you take this as a lesson not just for today, but for the years before today." The words sank deep, heavier than any reprimand, heavier than any punishment. Because he knew. He knew this wasn't about one mistake. He knew today wasn't an accident. He had let her unravel, had let her expose herself, and now? Now there was nothing left to hide behind. Emily locked her phone, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She kept walking, but she had nowhere left to go. Emily slowed her steps as she passed the first-class lounge, the space she had once moved through with effortless authority. The polished glass doors reflected the warm glow of chandeliers, the quiet murmur of conversation filtering out as well-dressed passengers reclined in plush seats, sipping expensive wine, waiting for their next flight. For years, this had been her world, a place where she had been the one deciding who was welcome, who received attention, who deserved priority. She had walked these floors with confidence, never second-guessing her place. Now no one even looked at her. No polite nods from pilots passing by, no fellow crew members exchanging quick smiles. She was invisible. She wasn't part of this space anymore. She never truly had been. For the first time, she understood what it felt like to be on the other side, to be dismissed, ignored, treated as if she didn't belong. And the worst part? There was no one to complain to. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, her feet rooted to the floor for a moment longer before she forced herself to move. She kept walking, but now she understood exactly what she had lost. How many times does this happen to people who don't have power? Let's talk about it in the comments. Discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the unspoken moments, the skipped eye contact, the ignored presence. Share this story and stand up for justice. Like, share, comment, be the change.